Good morning, everybody, and happy International Women's Day. Can you hear me? Does that sound? Good morning. I'm Margaret Abraham, and it is really my pleasure to welcome you here today. This event is in commemoration of International Women's Day and Women's History Month. As you know, International Women's Day is a global day, celebrated each year on March 8th. Emerging from women's rights movements, it highlights issues of gender equality, violence, and abuse against women. For many of you, as you know, International Women's Day raises greater awareness about issues impacting women's equality and equity. It calls out on issues of inequality and injustices while working towards positive action and social change. It highlights and recognizes the important gains made and celebrates women's achievements and accomplishments. We, of course, here today are at a time when there are a lot of challenges and backlash for women and women's movements, but we are also inspired by those who rise against the tide to make a progressive change. Today's event is sponsored by the Hofstra Cultural Center and is co-sponsored by Women's Studies Program, the Department of Sociology and Criminology Program, the Honors College, and Political Science. I want to especially acknowledge Ms. Atheline Collins, Executive Director of Hofstra Cultural Center, who's not here today, but who has been pivotal to making this program happen and came under, worked through this even in challenging times. I also want to thank her team, Janine and Carol. And I also want to thank the co-directors, Anne Berlin and Stephanie Nannis of Women's Studies. So I think first we give a round of applause to them before we start to talk about our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker today, and I am so happy and pleased to introduce my colleague, friend, and a well-known sociologist, Dr. Valentine M. Moghadam. And we're pleased to have her here. There's a lot I can say about Professor Moghadam, but I'm going to limit it to a little bit. Valentine Moghadam is Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Northeastern University, Boston. From January 2012 to May 2017, she served as the director of the International Affairs Program. Previously, she was Professor of Sociology and Director of Women's Studies at Purdue University and Illinois State University. A section chief at UNESCO in Paris, where she led policy-oriented research on gender equality and development in the social and human science sector, and a senior researcher at the United Nations University Wider Institute in Helsinki, Finland, where she coordinated the research program on women and development. Born in Tehran, Iran, Professor Moghadam received her higher education in Canada and the United States. Her areas of research are globalization, transnational social movements and networks, and gender, politics, and the development in the Middle East and North Africa. Her most recent co-authored with Shamiran Mako is After the Arab Uprising, Progress and Development in the Middle East and North Africa, Cambridge 2021. A recent article co-authored with Sahar Shakiba and Omid Gadarzadeh is Women in Iranian Kurdistan, Patriarchy and the Question for Empowerment in Gender and Society, and it's really an excellent article. She authored Institutions, Feminist Mobilizations and Political Economy, Debating Equal Inheritance in Tunisia. Among her many other publications, and I do have to say that because Valentine is prolific. Her first book was Modernizing Women, Gender, and Social Change in the Middle East in 1993, and had an updated third edition in 2013. Her 2005 book, Globalizing Women, Transnational Feminist Networks, won the American Political Science Association's Victoria Scott Award for Best Book on Women and Politics for 2005. Professor Moghadam has lectured widely, has formed and has led research teams, and is active in several professional association and international research networks. I have the privilege of working with her at the International Sociological Association. In fall 2021, she served as Clue Chair, Countries and Culture of the South, Library of Congress, Washington, D.C., working on the topic Varieties of Feminism in the Middle East and North Africa. The title of today's talk is Iran's Protesting Women. Please join me in giving Dr. Valentine Morada a warm welcome to Hofstra University.
Thank you so much, Professor Abraham. Greetings to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at Hofstra. This is my first visit, and what a wonderful looking audience. So I'm sure you are all very eager to hear a little more about the protests that have been going on in Iran since last September. And I'm going to try to give you as broad and wide a context and also analysis as I can. So let us now move on to, this of course is Mahsa, Jina, Amini. On September 13th of last year, Mahsa, also known as Jina in her home province of Kurdistan, Mahsa Amini, a young Kurdish woman from the western city of Saqqez, was visiting Tehran with her family when she was stopped by the Gasht-e-Irshad guidance patrol. Sometimes here they're known as the morality police. It's a special unit that is charged with enforcing Iran's compulsory veiling and sex segregation. Iranian women have been creative. I don't know if this is on. I better stand over here for a while. Okay, just okay. Iranian women have been creatively defying compulsory veiling for some time by pushing their headscarves back and wearing colorful clothing. But most recently, after his election in 2021, the current president, Ebrahim Raisi, called for stricter enforcement measures. Mahsa Amini was detained and taken in for questioning. Shortly thereafter, she was hospitalized after losing consciousness, and she died at Kasra Hospital several days later. The authorities attributed her death to underlying health conditions, but her family denied that she had any. This is a map of Iran, and I just want to point out where she is from. Of course, Iranian Kurdistan, which is one of the western provinces, and my family is from Azerbaijan, which is north of there. And then, of course, you see Tehran, sort of center north. It is a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic country, and we also have several different religions in Iran. Most Iranians are Shia Muslims, but we also have some Sunni Muslims, especially in Kurdistan, also in Sistan, Baluchistan, and in the South Khuzestan. And then we have smaller religious minorities of Zoroastrians, the original religion in Iran, Christians, Jews. We also have Baha'is, but they're the only religion that is proscribed, actually. I mean, people, there is a community that practices Baha'ism, but it's highly, highly discriminated community. Okay. So the day after her death was announced, protests broke out in cities across the country and continued into January of this year. Many called the nationwide uprising a woman-led revolution, unprecedented not only in Iran, but frankly throughout the world. Joined by countless men of all ages, social classes, and ethnicities, the protests were a bold show of shared anger over police brutality, the unjust targeting of the young Kurdish woman, and the Islamic regime's authoritarian rule. Those grievances were inscribed in the slogan heard throughout the country, Zan Zendegi Azadi, which is woman, life, liberty, or freedom. I should point out that back in 2011, when the Tunisian protests broke out and the government of President Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali fell, there was a witty refrain that was heard in the social media and in Iran itself that went like this: Tunis, Tunis, ma natunistim. I don't know if there are any Iranians in the audience, but it's, but it's a play on words, Persian words, that means the Tunisians could do it, but we couldn't. Well, that sure changed last September. Iran's protest wave engulfed all major cities, including the holy cities of Qom and Mashhad, very conservative religious cities, along with the marginalized and securitized region of Sistan and Baluchistan, which I mentioned, the southern province of Khuzestan, and especially Mahsa's own home province of Kurdistan. Some 67% of Iran's population is under the age of 40, and half of them are under the age of 24. So that is our Gen Z population, Generation Z population. And it's that group in particular that forms the bulk of the protesters. The young people have very different, I'm trying to figure out how to walk around with this, but I can't figure it out quite yet, so I'll just. The young people have very different expectations about the future of the country. University and high school students were the major social force behind the protests. Most of them had the blessing of their parents and grandparents, you know, like boomers, especially those who had taken part in the protests of previous decades or who quietly opposed the regime's restrictions but dared not act. I was just trying to see how I can turn this on. It's on now? Yeah. Now I can walk around a bit. Thank you. So some of the ones over there can also see me. All right. Now I have to come back here. Okay. So the forms of collective action across the country were dramatic. Young women burning their headscarves in anger and some cutting their hair in a display of mourning for Mahsa. Others defacing images of the clerical leaders, yet others just walking about defiantly without their headscarves on. And schoolgirls, as you can see, were especially visible and vocal. And of course, our Iranian friend here can read what's up there: Azadi, freedom, and then it says Jumhuri Baraye Iran, just republic for Iran, not Islamic Republic. And here are some of the other scenes of the young women cutting their hair, burning their headscarves, and taking to the streets. According to one account, let's see if I've got one more here. Yeah. According to one account, the first 82 days of the protests took place in 160 cities, with a total of 544 street protests. Almost every university and numerous high schools saw protests by students, which gives you a sense of the scope and scale of the protests across the country. From the start, young men joined the protests and eventually began to throw stones at police and then attack police stations and vehicles. The slogans chanted became ever more radical: death to the dictator, down with the regime. As I said, Iran is a multi-ethnic and multi-linguistic country, and the nationwide protests showed a common sense of anger and frustration with the Islamic State. And in a predominantly Shia Muslim country, where Kurds, by the way, have historically felt oppressed, the very fact that so many Iranian Shia Muslims came out into the street in solidarity with Mahsa Amini, a young Sunni Kurdish woman, shows really the widespread sense of solidarity, but also the political maturity of Iran's protesters and those young women and men. And here are some photos of the kids protesting and pushing back against police, actually. So, as with many of our protests across the globe over the past 2 decades, the protests in Iran were what we call horizontal, that is, leaderless, often spontaneous, and without a defined program or strategy. This horizontalism, I'm sure some of you who are in political science and sociology, studying social movements, probably have come across this term. It's a very different type of protest from the ones that we boomers were part of, which were very organized and hierarchical, and the leaders told us what to do, and so on and so forth. Our Generation X, and especially our Generation Z, have a very different way of protesting. They were coming out into the streets without a defined program or strategy. But there were common demands, grievances, and information sharing. The methods of choice were Twitter and Instagram. Normally, Iranians, and especially youth, use social media to connect with family and friends, to share pages on humor, entertainment, fashion, celebrity, favorite celebrities, and so on. But this changed with what one Instagram analyst in Iran called the Mahsa moment, when he noted a shift to what he called popular subversive pages. So the protests were followed by repression, arrests, deaths, and at least 4 summary executions of young men who were charged with violence. I think most of you in this room heard about them. This is some of the violence that these young people were charged with. And this is a map from Human Rights Watch, which shows the level of violence and repression. And you can see that it's precisely those marginalized, securitized provinces that saw the largest numbers of protests, and also where most of the repression occurred as well. So Sistan and Baluchistan, and of course Kurdistan. By January of this year, the protests were no longer as large and widespread as the preceding months, but expressions of defiance and opposition continued. As I said, women and girls have been walking around, and they continue to do so, without hejab. And security forces are evidently telling them to leave them be. In fact, Professor Abraham mentioned that I co-authored a paper with 2 Iranian Kurdish sociologists who are based at the University of Sanandaj in Iran. And I was on Skype speaking with the professor, Omid Qaderzadeh, about 2 weeks ago. And he was telling me that his Kurdish students are coming to class without hijab, and that's perfectly all right, and nobody is bothering them. So it's very interesting that the authorities are stepping back a little bit and acknowledging that this is a serious crisis of legitimacy for them. But we don't know how long this will last. In some neighborhoods in Tehran, young people have been taking to their balconies and rooftops at night to shout anti-regime slogans. They were doing that in 2009, and I will tell you about the Green protests in 2009 in a minute too. But the slogans were different then. They would go up there and they were appropriating one of the religious frames, so to speak, of the Islamic Republic, which is Allahu Akbar. But they were taking it back, as it were, and going up onto the rooftops and shouting Allahu Akbar. This time, there's no Allahu Akbar. This time, it's Marg bar diktator, and down with the regime. And the slogans are much more radical. In February last month, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, announced the imminent release of several thousand young people who had been imprisoned, although he said that those deemed to be agents of outside forces would remain in prison. So all of these developments, allowing young women to walk around without hijab, the release of so many of these imprisoned youth, seem to suggest, A, that women's fear of the Islamic State and its security forces had dissipated, and B, that the regime was acknowledging that it had a very severe crisis of legitimacy and that it had to make some concessions. So, that was by way of introduction, and I want to address, in the rest of my talk, I want to address the following questions. Beyond the proximate cause of these protests, which was, of course, the death in police custody of Mahsa, what are the broader and deeper roots of the protests? How were they related to previous cycles of protest? And what gender, ethnic, and class dynamics have been on display? My second question, how do local and international factors intersect to produce aspirations, grievances, and claims, or to exacerbate them? And third, the widespread nature of the protests was definitely significant. The question is this the end of the Islamic Republic? Or is it capable of reforming itself? That's the big debate in Iran right now. What future can we expect for the Iranian people and the Iranian state? Okay, so the roots of the protests. The protests of September through December 2022, and that's when they were widespread and huge, etc., they were distinctive and unprecedented in many ways, but they were part of a long-standing cycle of dissent and collective action that has been directed at the Islamic regime since its founding. Women, for example, organized the very first protests following the Islamic Revolution, gathering in Tehran on, yes, March 8th, 1979, exactly 46 years ago today, a day after Ayatollah Khomeini called on women to observe hijab. They marched out into the street and said, no compulsory hijab. Khomeini initially backed off, and a public discussion ensued, even among his key female supporters, regarding whether hijab should be mandatory or voluntary. Do the religious minorities also have to observe compulsory hijab, and so on. But the debate did not last long. The Islamist forces dislodged their erstwhile allies in the anti-Shah struggle and embarked on a politically repressive and socially regressive program. Islamization occurred in the fields of law, education, culture, and gender relations. Hijab was made compulsory, was strictly enforced, and came to symbolize the moral and cultural transformation of society by the new Islamist authorities. The political process came to be dominated by the Islamic clerical establishment, which was entirely male and highly masculinist. Now, the 1980s were probably the worst decade in Iran. They were characterized by intense ideological pressures, these new laws and so on, but also the war with Iraq. Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, and there ensued a very brutal 8-year war. My late father lived in Iran at the time, and it was very, very difficult, and sometimes he would call and write us and tell us about these bombings that were going on in the cities, and both countries were bombing each other's cities and forces of production as well. There were also multiple executions that took place at the end of the decade, shortly before Khomeini's death. The 1990s, I said, thank God. The 1990s and early years of the new century saw important changes, and both politically and socially. So things began to relax a little bit in the 1990s after Khomeini's death and after the end of the war with Iraq and the coming to power of a new president, Rafsanjani, known as a pragmatist. And he had these two incredible daughters who are feminists, and I'll mention one later on. Politically, Iran's conservatives, reformists, hardliners, and feminists came to populate the public sphere in the 90s and into the new century, though not equally, of course. The political system itself came to be comprised largely of pragmatists and then reformists who sought Iran's greater integration into the international system, along with a relaxation of social and cultural restrictions. And in fact, in the first edition of my book, Modernizing Women, that Professor Abraham mentioned, which came out in 1993, and in the second edition in 2003, I do highlight, in the chapter on Iran, I do highlight those new legal and policy changes which had come about. But there were always those very conservative, reactionary hardliners, Usul Garon, who opposed such changes. Presidential elections came to be characterized by pendulum swings between reformists and hardliners. Not so different from what we see in the United States between Democrats and Republicans. It's kind of the same thing in Iran. It goes back and forth. The most promising years after the revolution were during the reform era under Presidents Rafsanjani and Khatami, where the 5th and 6th parliaments, 1996 to 2005, contained the most active women members. You know, in political science and feminist political science, we have these concepts of descriptive representation of women and substantive representation of women. Descriptive representation is the sheer numbers or proportions of women that you will find in any particular political entity, parliament, Congress, cabinet, what have you. In Iran, there are always very, very small numbers and small proportions. But in Iran, they were also substantive, especially in this 5th and 6th parliaments. There were 13 and 15 women in a parliament of like 270 people, and boy, were they active, and they tried to pass and introduce and pass a number of bills for women's rights. But they did succeed in a few cases, but in other cases, for example, for Iran to adopt to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The parliament did vote on it, but another body, Iran's version of the Supreme Council, said no. Okay. So, at the same time, significant, so we're talking about this, late 90s, the early years of the new century. Significant socio-demographic changes had occurred, increasing educational attainment, including high female university enrollments, a rising age at first marriage, widespread contraceptive prevalence among married women, they're the ones who get counted in Iran, and declining fertility. Most recently, Iran's fertility is at replacement, and in cities like Tehran, it's actually below replacement. So that is now a social problem, according to the authorities. But that gives you a sense of the incredible social and cultural change in Iran. So that's our, generation X and Z. Those changes, let's see, where are we? And here are some of those. So these are photos from those early those early years of this new century, where you see these young people, young women, for example, at an internet cafe, and there was mixing there, actually. And you can see that. This is during the Reform era, where you didn't have this geshte shah that was going around, not always, sometimes, and enforcing compulsory veiling and no sort of sex integration. So you see the gentleman over there and these two women with their headscarves pulled back. That was very, very common. And it just became common for young women just to defy compulsory hijab. Now, in Iran, and I noticed this when I went back after so many years, in 1994 and then again in 96, you could tell who the supporters of the Islamic regime were and who the dissidents and the opponents were in terms of women, also men, by the way they dressed. And also with the men, by the way they dressed and what kind of facial hair they had. So with the women, if they're wearing the black chador, or if they're wearing a black makna'e, which covers the shoulder, and then a long black manteau, they are the supporters of the Islamic regime. But if you see gals like that, that's very, very different. And in between, there are different styles of dress as well. Okay. So those changes that you can observe in these pictures, and by the way, the other two pictures were of gals at a football match. For a while, young women were not allowed. So ridiculous. They were not allowed to attend a football match. This is soccer. Because, of course, the young men were running around looking really cool and in shorts. Okay, and young women are not supposed to, be, observe that sort of thing and be exposed to that sort of thing. But then they went out and started protesting about that. We want the right to cheer our team. And they were finally allowed to do so, especially for the qualifying matches. How did these changes come about? Well, in part through what we call world society or world polity effects. Access to the international domain through satellite TV and the growing social media platforms, as well as increased international travel. And this brought about these shifts in awareness and aspirations in this new population of young people who were ready to take to the streets when the opportunity arose. One of the victories of those substantive feminists, those critical actors in Iran's Majlis, that small number of them, was the abrogation of a law that banned young women, unmarried women, from traveling abroad to study. So then they were allowed to study. And that really changed a lot of things. And by the way, even today, there are a lot of young Iranian women, for example, at my university, Northeastern, there are a lot of young Iranian women, mostly in the engineering departments, because Iran, right? Because Iran has excellent engineering, science. Is that where you're from? What, Sharif or where? Tehran University, well, there you go. So Tehran University and Sharif are the two, Harvard and Yale or MIT, I think. Okay. So all of this, led to, these changes in aspirations, in awareness and in dress. In this new generation of young people who were ready to take to the streets when the opportunity arose. So the reformists, who had been in power for about 8 years, they lost to the hardliners, that pendulum swing that I mentioned, in the 2005 presidential and parliamentary elections. The government of the new hardliner president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, clamped down on this emergent civil society, generating dissatisfaction among young middle-class Iranians, especially that demographic that I just mentioned. their response to the 2009 presidential election, which gave Ahmadinejad a second term, which was largely viewed as rigged, produced the Green protests, in which women were a very large and visible presence. So you see where they are. You see they are here. And these are the Green protests back in 2009, protesting that a presidential election that gave Ahmadinejad the second term. And they're saying, where is my vote? And basically calling for new elections, but that didn't happen. The Obama administration, let me see. Oh, did I want to show you this one too, or not yet? Not yet. Okay. The Obama administration. Yeah, right. Okay. So here's another one. I mean, this is just to show you the kind of defiance that has been going on in Iran even before the protests. So this is part of that cycle of protests and this shift in attitudes, aspirations, and grievances that have been going on for quite some time on the part of this Gen X and especially this Generation Z or Z. This is White Wednesdays, when these gals would be going out into the streets and just taking off their hijab, mostly standing on a utility pole like that. And some people would walk by and cheer them on and clap, but if one of those coppers came around, in one case, there was one incident where this girl was pushed off the utility pole and broke her legs. But this is just what was going on. This is the change. This is the cultural change in Iran. And that's why September through December protests were inevitable. You see what's going on in the one that's in the lower left. These are guys who are making fun of compulsory hijab, and in both a sense of their humor, but also solidarity with the fact that women have to cover their heads. They are now showing that. Okay, so the Obama administration responded to the Ahmadinejad government's uranium enrichment program with sanctions. Okay, now, Iran has had a lot of sanctions. Another country that has had a lot of sanctions, anybody know which other country had a lot of sanctions in the previous? Iraq. And they were a lot, the effects, the socioeconomic, sociodemographic effects in Iraq were just brutal. 3 of the UN officials who were charged with enacting those UN sanctions in Iraq resigned from disgust with what had happened, Dennis Holiday and 2 other people. But Iran has also been subject to all these sanctions as well. The effects have been pretty bad, not as bad as Iraq, but pretty bad nonetheless. So Ahmadinejad, so during this time there were more sanctions, etc. And this is a listing of all of them since 1979, but they were really ramped up. Frankly, they were ramped up under Obama. So Ahmadinejad's economic mismanagement led to a rift with the supreme leader, which enabled the return of reformists and the presidency of Hassan Rouhani. So again, this pendulum swing between conservatives and reformists, Iran's version of Republicans and Democrats. Diplomacy and the promise of normalization allowed the reformist government of Hassan Rouhani to conclude the Iran nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, in 2015. That was the height of international diplomacy, and that was one of the most positive developments of the Obama administration. And I want to show you, well, no, not quite yet. But only 2 years later, you get a new president. What was his name? Trump? And the hostility of Trump and Pompeo and all of those people towards international treaties, period, and especially this agreement with Iran, led to the U.S. withdrawing from this international treaty. Oh, by the way, do we have a rules-based international order? I'm not sure about that, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. Where are the rules and who makes them? Okay, so economic difficulties generated by tough U.S. sanctions, even tougher, they were called maximum pressure sanctions under Trump, Pompeo, Bolton, et al., but also combined with Iranian government mismanagement, and then the onset of austerities, which the Iranian regime had to adopt because of sanctions and so on, led to some of those austerities included the end of subsidized fuel and the increase in the price of fuel. That led to a new wave of protests in late 2017 into early 2018, and then again in November 2019. Those were mostly led by working class and lower income men. So those are what we call the Day and Aban protests. So that was part of that cycle of protests that I've been mentioning. Let me see, where am I? Right, okay. So that happens, and then the hardline attitudes are reinforced among the political elites. Okay, let me just take a moment here to point out that Iran, the Islamic State, has been facing two sets of crises. One is a crisis of legitimacy, which you can see during this, this run-up, basically, to the 2022 protests. And that is the most severe crisis of legitimacy that the Iranian state has faced. And the second one is an economic crisis. And the economic crisis is generated by a combination of what I tried to allude to at the beginning of my lecture, internal and international, sanctions and government mismanagement, sanctions and privatization, sanctions and austerities. So we have a lot of blame going around. So the two are linked. This crisis of legitimacy and the economic crisis are linked in that U.S. sanctions on trade and finance have led to a reduction in government revenue, which has hurt ordinary citizens, who then turn their anger and frustration towards the regime. Grievances are found among educated middle-class youth who find it difficult to find jobs, and women and girls who are already opposed to the state's cultural and gender restrictions. Unemployment is high in Iran. Inflation is very high in Iran. Unemployment is very high in Iran. The highest rates of unemployment are among young people. That's not only in Iran, it's in some other countries too. But it's quite serious in Iran. Meanwhile, citizens in those ethnic, 2 or 3 of those ethnic provinces regard themselves as both left behind economically and hurt more so than some of the other provinces because of those austerity measures. And they also find themselves and feel themselves to be culturally oppressed as Sunnis, as Arabs, as Sistanis, Baluchis, Kurd, etc. Even among the segment of the population that normally supports the Islamic State, people are reeling from the economic crisis, from the austerities, from unemployment, from the precarious work conditions that have come about because of privatization, and also the rising prices, inflation and rising prices. So over the past decade, there have been periodic protests by teachers, workers, bus drivers, and they have both material demands, but also they've been calling for freedom of association. There are recognized, quote unquote, unions and associations in Iran, but also a lot of unrecognized associations of teachers, bus drivers, et cetera, and I'll tell you about a charter of demands in a little while that came out of Iran by those groups. But civil society in Iran is quite disorganized. The regime has done a pretty good job of suppressing civil society, and Professor Abraham mentioned the book that I wrote with Shamiran Mako after the Arab uprisings. Tunisia is different from Iran in that respect. Tunisia had, one of the advantages that Tunisia had, which is why it was the one Arab country that was able to embark on this democratic transition until this current crazy president pulled this coup last year, but okay. We can talk about that later on, was there's very strong civil society, which included a very strong, very large trade union, the UGTT, and two very strong feminist organizations, Femmes Démocrates and Aftour, along with a human rights organization. I mean, civil society in Tunisia, even during the period of authoritarianism, was very highly developed. That has not been possible in Iran. And that's why our movements are more horizontal than organized, and they were more organized in Tunisia. Okay, so, okay. There also have been these sporadic protests in those marginalized and securitized provinces. Iran also, like so many other countries, is suffering from climate change. And in the south in particular, there is lack of water and also pollution. And that's where a lot of the oil rigs are found as well. So there were these sporadic protests in these different provinces. But last September through December was the first time they all converged over class, gender oppression, and ethnic oppression. Those grievances also were inscribed in what became the anthem of the nationwide protest, the beautiful, poetic, moving song called Baroye by Shervin Hajipur, who wrote it back in September. I don't know if some of you have heard it. In February, it won a Grammy Award in a new special merit category recognizing a song for social change. Baroye has been translated as for or because of, and the song lists all the reasons behind those protests. The oppression of my sister and yours, excuse me, I get a little emotional when I think about this beautiful song. Being able to dance and kiss, the poverty, the poor who live under bridges, the imprisoned intellectuals. And that's Shervin. And he's the author of this beautiful song, and he's now become famous, and his song has become famous, of course. It's a brilliant, brilliant song. Okay, now I want to shift a little bit. Have I taken too long?
No, that's all right. Yeah, we'll have a that's all.
Because, I want to talk a little bit about the role of the US and the European Union in all of this. Because once again, as I always tell my students, whatever issue or problem there is that you are examining, especially in the global south, you have to look for internal factors and forces and external factors and forces. There's no question that the Iranian regime has been oppressive to so many of its citizens, and no question whatsoever that women have faced codified discrimination. That's beyond dispute. And in the wake of the Mahsa Amini protests, some in the diaspora called for Western intervention to help enact regime change. Okay. That would be a very serious mistake. And not only because of the wreckage caused by international intervention in Afghanistan in 2001. I mean, what does 20 years of the US and NATO in Afghanistan have to show for? Western intervention in Iraq in 2003. In Libya, the NATO bombing in 2011. Libya is a failed state and a conduit for human and sexual trafficking. And the internationalized civil conflict in Syria as a result of all those jihadists going into Syria to fight the Assad regime. I mean, you know, this is not the world that we really want. And anyway, in Iran, the military forces are very strong, and there would be a very, very serious regional war if there were to be any international interventions. I should also say that the 1953 coup d'etat that was orchestrated basically by the US and UK to end the liberal nationalist government of Mohammad Mossadegh and to bring the Shah back to power, that still looms large in the nation's historical memory. Even this new generation knows about it because they heard about it from their parents and grandparents. See, so that's not what we want. We don't want state destabilization, and we don't want external military, bombardments and so on. At some point, the Iranian people will hold those responsible for the problems in Iran to account, just as they did in Portugal, in Spain, in Chile, in Argentina. The people did it themselves, and the Iranian people will do it themselves as well. Okay, so let me just show you a few more pictures and then try wrapping up. This was the years of hope with the signing of the JCPOA, and then it all collapsed when Trump pulled out. And then, of course, the hardliners come back. Again, that pendulum swing, which I said, usually every time the US turns on the screws against Iran, the government turns on the screws on its citizens and also behaves badly internationally. These are some of the, there's been so much global solidarity with the Iranian protests. There were, early on, there was a concert in Tunis by this famous Tunisian singer. She became famous during the 2011 protests in Tunisia, Amel Maslousi. And she held a concert in solidarity with Iranian women in which she sang a very well-known and beautiful Iranian song about love and sympathy called Sultan Qalbha. It was very, very moving. The British band Coldplay, I think some of you would know, they're pretty cool. They had a concert. They had a concert too, in which they played actually Baroye, and there was an Iranian actress who was on the stage and sang along with Shervin singing. There have been rallies all over the world, really huge rallies in Toronto, a huge rally in Berlin, and smaller rallies in other European cities, in Latin America, in India, and Afghanistan. It's so, I mean, look at this. Iran barkhast, hala nobat mast. Oh dear. I mean, the solidarity from these Afghan women who themselves are so oppressed is really quite moving. So that global international solidarity has really been, very, very moving. Okay, this is what our young people look like. this is what they want to be able to go around and look like and walk around like that. And I think that will come to pass at some point, as we say, inshallah. But that kind of defiance by this Generation Z is really very, very impressive. And that's the sort of thing that in a minute would have gotten you arrested, 10 years ago. But after these protests, they're walking around like that. I think I should end now because I want to be able to, maybe during the discussion, talk about where Iran might be heading, just to end on the note that there are serious debates within Iran, even within the political elite as we speak. And there are also some members of civil society who are getting together, unrecognized associations of teachers, workers, etc., who have issued a charter of demands, which came to some of us in the West, and for example, I signed it as well. The fact that it came from Iran is, I think, very, very important. So let us hope for change in Iran soon. Thank you, and sorry to take so long.
Thank you so much, Professor Morgada. I think we can give one really loud round of applause. Oh, that's your water. That's my flavored water. Thank you. How excited I was. And I do have to say this was so not only informative but thought-provoking, right? Because it allows us not only to think about the personal, but also about what is the U.S. role and how movements don't just come up, but they are developed over a period of time. So many things to think about it, as I say, as a sociologist at the micro, meso, and macro levels. So both locally, nationally, and globally. So I would like to open up the floor. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Morgada. I want to open the floor for questions, and please come to the mic for your questions. And this is a wonderful opportunity we have to ask questions and have Professor Morgada answer some of them.
If you want to challenge me on anything, go right ahead. We'll have a nice conversation.
I'm wondering whether we can just take the mic.
Oh, maybe the mic.
Yeah, let's do that because I think it's harder to move from there.
How do you suggest the best way for American people to assist the women in Iran, as well as how do we dismantle the systems that make it worse for Iranian women in America?
I think the Iranian women who are in the United States, in some way, we're all very privileged. Whether it's those of us who have been living here for quite some time and teaching, or those students that I mentioned who are coming from Iran and going into these, they're being recruited into these engineering departments. So, it's interesting that throughout all these years of hostility between Iran and the U.S., U.S. universities keep recruiting these really bright students from universities like Tehran and like Sharif and others too, mainly for mathematics. The STEM disciplines is where they really excel in Iran. As for what you can do for women in Iran, I think that the best thing is to extend solidarity for change in Iran, but through, for example, social media, through rallies. I mean, last semester when I was, teaching a class on women in world politics, I had this gal who was Iranian American, and every week she organized rallies on Boston Common, for example, in solidarity with the protesters in Iran. That sort of thing is very good. I'm going to go out on a limb and, say something that, not everyone agrees with me, not even some of my compatriots who are in the diaspora, but I do believe that the sanctions are doing more harm than good. They're doing more harm than good, both, of course, for relations. Sanctions do not hurt regimes. By the way, how long have there been U.S. sanctions against Cuba? Okay. Sanctions hurt ordinary citizens. You know, do we want ordinary Iranian citizens to suffer from these austerities? Do we want these girls, for example, their parents to have to struggle to put food on the table, to, you know, fill up their, you know, cars with, you know, petrol, you know, etc.? I'm totally opposed to sanctions because they don't work. The regime itself is in crisis because of the grassroots movements, because of these protests, because the regime itself knows that its days are numbered. And that has happened throughout history. I mean, we had military dictatorships in Southern Europe. The people of Southern Europe, Spain, Greece, Portugal, they ended those military dictatorships. In Latin America, we had brutal, you know, Argentina and Chile. What happened to citizens there was worse than what happened in Iran. Almost equal, but I mean, really brutal. The people there ended those regimes. And that will happen in Iran as well. So I am in favor of returning to the Iran nuclear deal. That will marginalize the hardliners and enable a little bit more peace in the region. Thank you for your question.
Hi. I guess my question is that you mentioned how protests in general began to shift dramatically from a more like structural sense to a horizontal sense that you described it as. And what do you think like contributed to that like change in how we protest? And do you think it is more significantly impactful the way we do it now then, or what's your thoughts on that?
That is a really good, really tough question. Back in the day, we had very strong left-wing movements and organizations and political parties. And they were the ones who would organize us. And we were members of those kinds of movements and organizations. And there was a strategy, there was a plan of action, there were directives, and so on. But that changed with the defeat of basically the left almost throughout the world. In the Middle East, the 1960s and 70s were filled with these left-wing socialist, communist, etc. movements and parties. And the regimes, in order to suppress them, what did they do? They encouraged Islamists. And also in other parts, well, in the United States, the left was never very, very strong, but you know, you did have, you know, certain things. But everything also changed with the collapse of world communism as well. So those structured, as you correctly pointed out, those structured parties, movements, organizations, etc., went by the wayside. And you know, there was, first of all, a period of disillusionment on the part of many of the activists, let's say, of my generation, but also the absence of that kind of leadership which would basically organize and mobilize people and tell them, listen, this is the plan, this is what we're doing, these are our demands, and this is our plan of action for the future. You see, which, for example, Occupy Wall Street didn't have. As much as I loved Occupy Wall Street, and I write about them in my book, Globalization and Social Movements, with a great deal of affection, actually, you know, they couldn't move forward. So there's a historic aspect to it, a global structural aspect to it. Are we going to see those kinds of movements and political parties again? It's really hard to say. But and then, as I mentioned, in a country like Iran, they really they systematically disorganized civil society. Yeah. So this is a problem that we have right now.
Any other questions?
Hi. Hello. Thank you so much. I just wanted to point out that maybe we could also connect the Iranian movement of women freedom to the American or worldwide, right? That the right to bodily rights in this country can be inspired also by what happened in Iran. And so I think that you were asking about how to be active in this country. I think like one of the ways to do it also is to connect, the kinds of things, the kinds of rights that women here want with, kind of world solidarity for women.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. That's absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, and trying to make those connections.
Yeah.
As you said.
Hi. So my question, you mentioned possibly being able to discuss, where do we go from here? What, as we've seen the cycles throughout history of protests and then sort of backsliding with like going back and forth between hardliners and reformists in the government. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are from, what could potentially happen from here on out. Will we kind of backslide once again, or are we hoping for a more sustainable change?
Yeah, thank you for that. I did allude to some of the debates that are going on in Iran right now. And those debates are going on among the political elites, including some of the political elites that are under house arrest. So former President Khatami, the reformist president, the past reformist president, a former prime minister who is still under house arrest, and he's been under house arrest since 2009, Mir Hossein Mousavi, another gentleman, Tajzadeh. These gentlemen are calling for institutional change and for a new constitution. Now, we definitely, absolutely need a new constitution in Iran, and that's one of the major demands in Iran. A new constitution and a referendum. Those gentlemen have been calling for it. Tajzadeh has actually said that the regime has two choices: a revolution from below or a revolution from above. And he says that a revolution from above will be less costly all around. And what he means is that there should be massive, significant, profound institutional change. Will there be institutional? I mean, if we had a new constitution, you saw those young girls on the blackboard, Republic for Iran, not Islamic, Republic for Iran. That means removing the entire theocratic edifice, supreme leader, council of guardians, Gasht Irshad, I mean, all of that Islamic stuff that those Islamic institutions that Iran has had. Now, our one secular institution is the parliament, is Majlis. That would stay, and it's a functioning parliament after all. But this other stuff, needs to go. And, there are other countries that, the U.S. hasn't changed its constitution either, but many countries do change their constitution periodically. A lot of countries do that. The French have done that, Germans, of course. Algeria and Tunisia, they had new constitutions, and they inscribe in their constitutions provisions for women's rights and for environmental protection. And we need that in Iran, too, since climate change has really badly, affected Iran. So the demand for a new constitution is one that is being issued in Iran by these reformists, these more, left reformists, as it were, and also by these protesters. They definitely want a new constitution and the removal of many of these, Islamic institutions. But will that happen? What I think is that if the Biden administration did what Biden promised to do, which was to return to the JCPOA as soon as he became president, we actually would have more of a chance of reform in Iran, because the hardliners would be on the defensive. And then these reformist voices and these radical young people's voices would be the ones that would push forward the very serious socioeconomic changes and institutional changes that we need in Iran. So again, internal and external factors and forces. Thank you for that.
One last question.
Hi, I was just wondering, I know you mentioned that like sanctions are doing more harm than good, and I was wondering if there was any sort of way that we can like advocate for limitations on sanctions, or is there any way that we can like come together to like make sure that there's like restrictions on certain sanctions that will be more beneficial to like the society in general?
Thank you for that. Yes, there are different forms of solidarity and support for the protesters that American young people, and you're the same generation as these young people in Iran with all their aspirations like these gals. And one, of course, is to have these rallies and protests and go on social media and support the women and support women's rights and make that connection between the regression of women's rights in the United States and also the call for the expansion of women's rights in Iran. But the other one is to call for an end to sanctions. It's one thing to have these targeted sanctions where you are sanctioning certain individuals, like certain political leaders. It's another thing entirely to put sanctions on trade and finance, because those are the kinds of sanctions that hurt the citizens. When the revenue that accrues to a government as a result of these sanctions occurs, and then governments have to impose austerities, that hurts the population. That's what happened in Cuba too. But the regimes stay in place. So sanctions do not work. In fact, there's an excellent book by, is his name Nicholas Mulder? And he has written a book on sanctions in Europe in the interwar period against like Italy and Germany. They did not work then either. You still had the rise of fascism. So, these kinds of sweeping economic sanctions, trade sanctions, are a disadvantage to ordinary citizens. And so call for the end of sanctions and the return to the JCPOA, please.
So thank you so much to the students and faculty who asked, and thank you so much, Professor Moradam. This was truly wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you once again, and thank you to the sponsors, and thank you to the Cultural Center. We'll see you for the next talk. Bye-bye.